Late April 1943. The war in North Africa was entering its final days. The German Africa Corps, once feared across the desert, was collapsing. Supply lines had crumbled. The Luftwaffe was gone. What remained of the Axis forces in Tunisia was surrounded, trapped between British 8th Army advancing from the south and American units closing from the west. Among the retreating columns was Heavy Panzer Battalion 501, one of the most elite units in the German army. They had arrived in Tunisia months earlier, bringing with them a weapon so new that Allied intelligence barely believed it existed: the Tiger Y heavy tank. 60 tons of armor and engineering ambition. Its name alone carried weight. Its gun, the famous 88mm, had already become legend. Allied tank crews spoke of it as if it were a living thing, a beast of the battlefield that could destroy any tank before they could even see it. But as the Africa Corps began its final retreat, the fearsome Tigers were dying not in battle, but in silence. One after another, their engines sputtered to a stop. There was no fuel left to feed them. One by one, they were abandoned in the dust. In a quiet olive grove near Tunis, British reconnaissance patrols stumbled upon one of these giants. It stood there motionless, its gun pointing east, the symbol of a war machine that had run out of breath. On the turret, painted in white, were three numbers: 712. The soldiers who found it could hardly believe what they were seeing: a Tiger tank, completely intact. No shell holes, no fire damage, no demolition charges placed inside. The Germans had left their most valuable tank, their most secret weapon, sitting unguarded among the trees. When British engineers arrived, they realized what they had: a machine that could tell them everything the enemy had been hiding. What lay inside was not just a tank, but a secret, forged in the factories of Henschel and Krupp, carried into war with the weight of Germany's pride. The olive grove was still. Only the soft clicking of cameras and the hiss of fuel lamps broke the silence. Engineers circled the Tiger cautiously, fearing booby traps. But when they pried open the hatches, they found everything as it had been left: ammunition neatly stored, tools arranged in racks, dials and levers gleaming with the precision of a machine barely broken in. Inside, the smell of oil and iron lingered. The logbook, left behind in haste, still bore the crew's last entries: fuel, low; order, withdraw; result, abandoned. There was no sabotage, no scuttling charge, only resignation. The crew had done what German doctrine forbade. They had left a Tiger alive. For Allied intelligence, this was a dream. For American ordnance officers, it was an opportunity that would never come again. Within hours, orders were transmitted through London and Washington: recover the Tiger intact, ship it to the United States for full technical evaluation. The recovery mission began at dawn. American and British mechanics worked side by side, threading cables around the immobilized tank. The Tiger weighed nearly 57 tons, too heavy for any standard recovery vehicle. M31 tank retrievers strained at their tow cables, while bulldozers pushed from behind. Dust and exhaust filled the grove as the giant began to move for the first time in days. The operation drew spectators from nearby units. Some men took photographs, posing beside the tank like hunters beside a lion they'd brought down. Others simply watched in silence, realizing that for all its power, this machine had been defeated by something as simple as fuel. Over the next 3 days, the convoy crept toward the coast. Every bridge had to be inspected, every hill climbed slowly. Villagers gathered to watch the spectacle: an enemy tank crawling under Allied guard, its iron skin gleaming under the sun. To them, it was a symbol of how far the German Empire had fallen. When the convoy reached Tunis harbor, the engineers faced one final challenge: loading the 60-ton Tiger onto a Liberty ship. They used the SS Samuel P. Bush, fitted with a 70-ton crane barely capable of lifting the load. For hours, the tank hung suspended in the air, chains groaning under the weight. Dock workers paused to stare. One British officer whispered, "They built a weapon too heavy for their own war." By nightfall, Tiger 712 rested securely on the ship's reinforced deck. Its turret was locked, its hatches sealed. The ship's manifest listed its cargo simply as "Captured German tank, highly confidential." The Atlantic awaited. 3 weeks later, the SS Samuel P. Bush reached the port of Norfolk, Virginia. The ship's hull was streaked with salt, her crew weary but proud. Word had already spread through the Army Ordnance Network that the United States was about to receive the most prized piece of captured German technology of the war. Waiting on the dock were officers in freshly pressed uniforms, photographers with government-issued cameras, and engineers from the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, men whose curiosity burned hotter than the summer sun. When the cranes lifted the tank from the ship's hold, the crowd fell quiet. Even stripped of insignia, the Tiger looked menacing. Its hull plates, thick as a man's arm, glinted beneath a coating of North African dust. Its gun, longer than any tank cannon then in American service, hung like a spear aimed at the horizon. To those who had fought in North Africa, this was the face of every rumor, every report of invincible German armor, now silent and chained. A special flatbed railcar had been prepared for the journey north. Its deck was reinforced with heavy beams and steel supports. As the Tiger was winched into place, soldiers and dock workers alike gathered along the pier to watch the strange procession. For most, it was the first time they had seen the weapon that had so terrified Allied tank crews. One soldier murmured, "That's what killed our boys at Kasserine." Another replied quietly, "Not anymore." The flat car rolled out under guard. Through small towns and quiet countryside, the massive shape of the Tiger drew spectators to the tracks. Children waved American flags. Factory workers stopped to watch as the armored beast passed by. To them, it was proof that even Germany's deadliest machine could be captured, studied, and perhaps defeated. In mid-July 1943, Tiger 712 arrived at the sprawling test grounds of Aberdeen, Maryland, the beating heart of American weapons research. It was here that every foreign weapon, from rifles to rockets, was dissected, measured, and understood. The Tiger was immediately rolled into a secure hangar surrounded by barbed wire and military police. Brigadier General Gideon Barnes, the Army's Chief of Research and Development, stood watching as technicians unbolted the transport restraints. For months, Barnes had been requesting an intact Tiger for analysis. He understood that to defeat an enemy weapon, one had to know not only how it fought, but how it lived, how it was built, maintained, and supplied. He ordered his team to proceed carefully. Every bolt, every weld, every mark, he instructed, tells a story. The inspection began that afternoon. Engineers approached the Tiger like archaeologists unearthing a lost civilization. They measured armor thickness with calipers, recorded serial numbers, and photographed every component. The steel bore the marks of Henschel's factories, elegant craftsmanship hidden beneath raw brutality. The gun drew the most attention. The 88mm KWK-36, adapted from the feared anti-aircraft gun, was in perfect condition. When test engineers disassembled the breech, they were stunned by its precision. The rifling was flawless, the recoil mechanism smooth and balanced. Even American machinists, accustomed to high standards, whispered their admiration. "This is no ordinary weapon," one remarked quietly. "This is art." The Tiger's layout fascinated American crews. Its massive turret provided ample room for the gunner and loader. The commander's optics offered a level of clarity unknown to most Allied tanks. Even the seats were padded, a luxury almost unheard of in American designs. But for every ingenious detail, there was a drawback. The interleaved road wheels, designed to spread weight evenly, were a maintenance nightmare. The transmission was complex, over-engineered, and prone to overheating. Accessing the engine required hours of disassembly. The Maybach HL-230 engine itself impressed the Americans with its size. A 12-cylinder gasoline powerhouse producing nearly 700 horsepower. Yet its efficiency figures raised eyebrows. One mechanic noted, "It takes a refinery to keep this thing moving." Still, admiration outweighed criticism at first. Reports from North Africa had described the Tiger as an unstoppable monster, and standing before it, few doubted why. Every inch of it spoke of industrial ambition, armor thick as fortress walls, a gun that could destroy any tank in existence, and a sense of purpose that reflected Germany's belief in technological dominance. Yet Barnes's team wasn't there to admire. They were there to test, and to find weaknesses. By late July, testing crews had completed the preliminary inspection. The Tiger was refueled, rearmed with inert shells, and made ready for mobility trials. Cameras were set up along the Proving Ground's test course. Fuel trucks waited at regular intervals. Engineers stood by with notebooks and stopwatches. As dawn broke over the Chesapeake, the Maybach engine coughed, sputtered, then came alive with a deep growl that echoed across the testing fields. Men covered their ears as the Tiger began to move, slow at first, then gathering speed. Dust rolled beneath its tracks. For the first time on American soil, a German Tiger tank was on the move. At 20 miles per hour, the tank handled smoothly, almost gracefully. Its suspension absorbed bumps with ease. Test drivers compared it favorably to the Sherman. The Tiger felt stable, grounded, almost comfortable. At the end of the first day, the engineers were impressed. One officer wrote in his log, "German engineering lives up to its legend." They did not yet know what the next tests would reveal. Morning at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The air was heavy with summer humidity as the engineers assembled for the first full round of mobility trials. Tiger 712 stood at the starting line, its pale German paint now streaked with mud and fingerprints from weeks of inspection. The gun, still capped and harmless, pointed forward like a spear at rest. To the men gathered there, this was not just another test. It was a confrontation with the legend that had haunted Allied armor since North Africa. The driver, a U.S. Army specialist trained in German vehicles, climbed inside and pulled the hatch shut. The Maybach HL-230 engine coughed once, twice, then burst into life with a roar that made the hangar walls tremble. Black smoke rolled from the exhaust stacks, spreading across the proving field like a signal fire. The smell of fuel and oil filled the air. For a moment, everyone stood silent, just listening. The Tiger did not purr like an American tank. It growled, deep, mechanical, defiant. General Barnes, watching from a raised platform, nodded once. "Let's see what this monster can do." The first trial was simple. A controlled road test on smooth pavement, 10 miles straight, then back again. Observers lined the course, clipboards in hand. The tank began to move slowly at first, then gaining confidence despite its weight, more than twice that of a Sherman. It accelerated steadily, the suspension absorbing bumps with remarkable grace. The massive interleaved road wheels rolled in perfect harmony, the sound of steel on steel echoing through the proving ground. The driver reported excellent handling. Steering was heavy but responsive. Gear changes, though stiff, worked cleanly. On the paved stretch, the Tiger reached nearly 25 miles per hour, an impressive figure for such mass. When the team reviewed their instruments, they saw fuel consumption figures that were high but acceptable. The Tiger, on a full tank, could travel roughly 120 miles on roads under ideal conditions. Barnes's engineers nodded in approval. For now, it met its own claims. But the real test would come next: off-road. The second phase took place on Aberdeen's cross-country course, miles of rough ground meant to simulate the varied terrain of combat. Hills, mud pits, water crossings, sand patches. The Tiger rolled forward, its treads biting into the earth with a rhythmic clatter. Each obstacle was met with the same brute confidence. Where lighter vehicles bounced and swayed, the Tiger glided, its heavy suspension keeping the gun steady. Mud splashed up its flancs, pooling around the lower hull. To the observers, it was a sight of raw power, mechanical dominance in motion. Then came the first problem. After barely 3 miles, one of the engine technicians waved to halt the run. Fuel pressure had dropped sharply. The readings showed massive consumption, far beyond expectation. The tank had burned through nearly a quarter of its fuel already. The test was resumed after refueling, but the numbers only grew worse. On rough ground, the Tiger was consuming nearly 4 gallons of gasoline per mile. At first, Barnes thought it must be a calibration error. He ordered the gauges checked twice. The result was the same. 4 gallons, enough to power a Jeep for a full day, gone in a single mile of mud. By the end of the 30-mile course, the Tiger had drained almost its entire tank. The engine sputtered to a stop halfway back to the garage, forcing mechanics to fetch fuel by truck. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. This was no minor inconvenience. This was something fundamental. To understand the tank's performance under combat-like stress, The team designed a third test. The Tiger would maneuver repeatedly, stopping, accelerating, traversing the turret, idling for observation, just as it would on the battlefield. For the next 4 hours, the tank roared across the field, its great guns swinging from side to side as the crew simulated engagements. By the end, the fuel readings were worse than anyone imagined. Under simulated combat conditions, Tiger 712 consumed nearly 6 gallons per mile, reducing its effective range to less than 25 miles before running dry. One engineer, staring at his clipboard, muttered, "It's like feeding a battleship." General Barnes walked slowly toward the tank, still warm from the run. He placed a hand on the armor, felt the heat through the thium metal, and said quietly, "This thing fights like a lion, and eats like one too." The post-test inspection revealed even more problems. The interleaved road wheels, while ingenious, trapped mud and sand between their layers. Cleaning them took hours. When left overnight, the packed mud hardened like concrete. The crew had to hammer it loose before each run. The transmission, though finely engineered, required constant attention. Every 2 hours of driving demanded 1 hour of maintenance. The mechanics joked grimly that the Tiger needed more rest than its crew. Yet through it all, the engineers couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. The welds were perfect, the armor seamless, the gun balance so precise that even with the engine off, one man could rotate the turret crank by hand. The Tiger was, in every sense, a masterpiece. But a masterpiece built without thought for the world around it. It was a machine designed to win battles in isolation, not wars fought across continents. The first official Aberdeen report summarized the situation in clinical language, but the tone was unmistakable. The Tiger I heavy tank represents a remarkable achievement in mechanical design and ballistic protection. Its offensive and defensive capabilities exceed any known Allied tank. However, the vehicle's excessive weight, complexity, and fuel consumption render it unsuited for sustained operations. In plainer words, it was a triumph that could not be maintained. A lion built for a sprint, not a campaign. When Barnes read the report, he knew what it meant. Germany had created a machine that could dominate any single battlefield, but one that could never be supplied fast enough, fueled long enough, or repaired easily enough to matter in the end. It was the beginning of the Tiger's unraveling, and the Americans had just discovered its fatal flaw. The findings from Aberdeen spread quickly through the corridors of Army ordnance in Washington. What had begun as a technical curiosity, an engineering evaluation of a captured tank, was now being treated as a matter of strategic significance. Colonel George B. Jarrett, chief of the Foreign Materiel Branch, received the report in early August 1943. He read the opening pages in silence, his pen tapping against the desk. By the time he reached the conclusion, he set it down and muttered, "Now we know why the Germans keep leaving them behind." The data was clear, cold, and irrefutable. A Tiger required nearly 2,000 gallons of gasoline each week just to remain operational. A battalion of 20 Tigers would burn through 40,000 gallons per year, more fuel than an entire American armored division of 53 Sherman tanks. For every Tiger that fought, another convoy of trucks had to fight its way across bombed-out roads just to keep it alive. Jarrett understood what the engineers had proven. The Tiger was not a weapon. It was a liability disguised as one. By autumn 1943, Allied intelligence officers began comparing the Aberdeen test results with captured German records and combat reports from the field. Patterns emerged immediately. Wherever Tigers had fought, they were found abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned out, but left intact beside roads and fields. In Tunisia, in Russia, and later in Italy, reconnaissance photographs showed the same thing. Columns of heavy tanks sitting motionless, often without visible battle damage. When captured crews were interrogated, they all gave the same answer: no fuel. One German officer from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion told his British captors that by late April, his unit could not even move between villages without air reconnaissance, first confirming a refueling corridor. He described how Tigers would advance a few miles, halt, and wait for fuel convoys that never arrived. "Every kilometer we drove," he said, "we paid for in gasoline we no longer had." The Aberdeen tests had transformed isolated battlefield anecdotes into a coherent picture. Germany's most powerful tank, the symbol of its engineering genius, had crippled its own army. The problem was not confined to fuel. Everything about the Tiger was a drain on resources. Each one required 1,500 man-hours of labor every week just to keep it serviceable. Its tracks wore out twice as fast as those on a Sherman, and replacing them required cranes and specialized tools. Its spare parts were unique, non-interchangeable with any other German tank, meaning entire factories existed solely to feed the Tiger's needs. American intelligence officers summarized it bluntly. Every Tiger in service consumes the strength of 3 Panzer IVs and delivers the operational mobility of half of one. That conclusion reached as far as General Eisenhower's planning staff. They saw at last what the German high command either ignored or refused to acknowledge. The Tiger was a tactical marvel that could not survive the strategic reality of modern war. By late 1943, Allied bombers were striking deeper into Germany every week. Synthetic fuel plants, refineries, and railway junctions burned night after night under the glare of incendiaries. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend the skies, consumed even more of the shrinking fuel reserves. Every drop diverted to fighters was a drop the Tigers would never see. In December, intelligence analysts produced a classified summary for Allied commanders. German heavy armor operations are now limited primarily by fuel availability rather than mechanical losses. This limitation will intensify as air superiority shifts in favor of the Allies. The conclusion was revolutionary. The Tiger was no longer viewed as a battlefield monster, but as a prisoner of its own appetite. The U.S. Army's tactical manuals were updated with new guidance for armored units encountering German heavy tanks. Do not engage directly unless necessary. Force movement. Make them burn fuel. A tiger that moves is a tiger that dies. Evidence from the front lines soon confirmed the Aberdeen results. Reports from Italy in late 1943 described German Tigers withdrawing without resistance simply because their fuel trains had been bombed. In one engagement near Salerno, British forces captured 3 Tigers intact, their engines undamaged, their guns still loaded. The German crews had fled on foot. Inside one of the tanks, Allied troops found a note scrawled on a maintenance log. Kein Benzin, keine Hoffnung. No gasoline, no hope. When these accounts reached Aberdeen, engineers compared them against their own field logs. Every number matched. The Tiger's theoretical road range of 120 miles had been reduced by reality to less than 40, and often far less in combat conditions. In mud, snow, or soft terrain, a Tiger could exhaust its entire fuel supply in a single day of fighting. The deeper the analysts looked, the clearer the truth became. The Tiger's brilliance was also its curse. Its heavy armor demanded a powerful engine. The engine demanded immense fuel. The fuel demanded trucks and depots and men to move it, all targets for Allied aircraft. In the end, the Tiger's strength made it helpless. General Barnes, reviewing the compiled data that winter, wrote in the margin of one report, "The German army built a weapon for victories it could no longer afford." When the report reached General Patton's headquarters in Europe the following year, he underlined a single passage. The Tiger tank cannot win a mobile war. Patton added his own note beneath it in bold pencil. Then that's exactly the war we'll give them. The Aberdeen findings didn't just explain German failures, they shaped Allied strategy. American and British armored units began training to exploit fuel dependency. Crews were instructed to maneuver constantly, to stretch engagements, to force the enemy to reposition repeatedly. If Tigers were spotted, artillery and aircraft were called to sever their supply routes rather than destroy the tanks themselves. It worked. Every forced movement drained their reserves. Every destroyed fuel convoy immobilized another battalion. By mid-1944, the pattern was complete. From Normandy to the Eastern Front, Tigers were being captured in greater numbers than they were destroyed. The Allies hadn't just outgunned them, they had outlasted them. In the dimly lit offices of Aberdeen, engineers studied maps of Europe dotted with reports of abandoned Tigers. The pattern was unmistakable. Wherever German supply lines faltered, the heavy tanks became stranded, silent, hulking monuments to overconfidence. Colonel Jarrett summarized the final intelligence assessment in one line. The Tiger tank is Germany's most powerful argument for simplicity. It was a quiet triumph for the Americans. Without firing a shot, they had discovered the secret that would bring the Tiger legend down. No amount of armor or firepower could save a machine that had to stop for fuel every 20 miles. Before a single Tiger was ever captured, the name alone had already spread through the Allied ranks like rumor carried on the wind. In Tunisia, then Sicily, then Italy, soldiers whispered about them. Some swore they had heard the heavy tracks long before seeing one. Others claimed a single Tiger could destroy an entire company. To young tank crews about to go into battle, the Tiger was more myth than machine. It had become a legend of invincibility. At Aberdeen, engineers now knew that legend for what it was, only half the truth. On paper, the Tiger was terrifying. On the ground, it was temperamental, expensive, and starving for fuel. But the soldiers in the field didn't have the luxury of reading reports. They faced what they could see and hear, and what they could see and hear made their blood run cold. In early 1943, U.S. Army medical officers began recording a peculiar phenomenon among tank crews. Whenever a Tiger was rumored to be in the area, units slowed their advance. Requests for artillery support tripled. Even veteran crews hesitated to move until air reconnaissance confirmed that the threat had passed. The reports used a term that soon entered official vocabulary: Tiger phobia. One officer in the 1st Armored Division wrote, "It is not the tank itself that defeats us, it is what men believe it can do." The fear was understandable. At Kasserine Pass, American tankers armed with 75mm guns had seen their shells bounce harmlessly off Tiger armor. Some crews emptied entire magazines without so much as scratching the paint. They watched their rounds spark and ricochet while the 88mm gun fired back with terrifying precision. The psychological impact was devastating. By the time news of the Aberdeen tests reached the front lines, Allied command recognized that morale had to be restored not by speeches, but by truth. Men had to see that the Tiger, for all its power, had weaknesses, and that those weaknesses could be exploited. In late 1943, the War Department issued a series of training circulars based directly on the Aberdeen findings. They were distributed to armored units under the heading, Understanding German Heavy Tanks. The language was clear and practical. The Tiger is heavily armored but slow. It consumes fuel at a rate far greater than any known vehicle. Its power lies in fear and in the assumption of invincibility. Avoid direct confrontation. Force movement. Deny resupply. Attack the tank through its fuel. The new manuals explained that every mile a Tiger drove brought it closer to immobilization. If Allied forces could keep the enemy moving, they would soon run out of fuel. When that happened, the monster was helpless. It could no longer maneuver, retreat, or even aim effectively. Crews were instructed to let aircraft and artillery finish what fuel starvation began. It was not glamorous doctrine. It was not heroic. But it worked. The effect on Allied tactics was profound. Instead of charging into duels with Tigers, American and British units began to think like hunters. Sherman tanks would move quickly, changing positions, forcing German armor to respond. Every turn of a Tiger's treads drained precious gallons. Every maneuver pushed it closer to exhaustion. Artillery officers learned to track fuel convoys instead of tanks. They struck supply depots and bridges ahead of German retreats. When the Tigers finally rolled in, they found only empty barrels waiting. By the time Allied tanks appeared, the German giants were already stranded. The myth of the Tiger as an unstoppable predator began to crumble. It was no longer a hunter. It was prey. The U.S. Army didn't stop at tactics. It launched an information campaign designed to reclaim the psychological advantage. Film crews at Aberdeen produced training reels showing American soldiers walking calmly around Tiger 712, explaining its design, pointing out its vulnerabilities, and demonstrating its limitations. One narrator spoke over footage of the tank's massive tracks. "This is the German Tiger. 60 tons of trouble for them, not for us. It burns 6 gallons of fuel per mile, which means one thing: when it runs out." The films were distributed to training camps across the United States and Britain. Young recruits watched, taking notes. For the first time, the Tiger became less a monster and more a problem to be solved. Fear gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to confidence. Reports from the front began to reflect the change. Tank crews no longer froze when they heard rumors of tigers nearby. They called for air cover, checked their maps, and planned their movements. They knew that every tiger burned its own fuse simply by existing. Even German crews began to feel the strain. The same men who once felt invincible inside the tiger now found themselves sitting idle, waiting for fuel that never came. They watched Allied tanks moving freely while their own remained trapped. Letters intercepted from German tankers spoke of frustration and fatigue. One sergeant from the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion wrote home, "We are kings when we have gasoline, beggars when we don't." Another added bitterly, "We have the best tank in the world, and it is killing us." The Tiger, once a symbol of German pride, had become a symbol of its exhaustion. By mid-1944, during the Allied invasion of France, the consequences of fuel starvation became impossible for Germany to hide. Tiger battalions that had been feared across Europe now fought in fragments, 3 or 4 tanks at a time, never more than a few miles from their supply lines. Many were destroyed not by enemy fire, but by their own crews, who lacked the fuel to retreat. The roads of Normandy were littered with burned-out Tigers, still intact but empty of life. American engineers back at Aberdeen marked every new sighting on their maps. Each abandoned tank was confirmation that the data they had gathered a year earlier was correct. They had not simply tested a vehicle, they had tested an empire's assumptions. From those reports grew a doctrine that shaped American armored warfare for the rest of the century. The lesson was simple but absolute. Firepower means nothing without fuel. In classrooms across the United States, future officers studied the Tiger's fate as a case study in over-engineering. They learned that every design decision carries a cost. Every additional inch of armor, every new piece of complexity, every gain in tactical strength must be weighed against the one resource that keeps an army moving. The Tiger had won its duels, but it had lost its war. At Aberdeen, engineers dismantled the Tiger's engine for the final phase of analysis. The pieces lay neatly labeled on steel tables: pistons, crankshafts, carburetors. Each component was a marvel of precision, but together they told a tragic story. Perfection pursued without restraint. One of the senior engineers turned to Colonel Jarrett and said, "They built a masterpiece that no army could afford." Jarrett smiled faintly, "And we'll make sure no one ever makes that mistake again." Outside, the American flag fluttered above the proving ground. The captured tank stood silent under its canvas cover, its lessons already written into doctrine, its roar now replaced by the hum of typewriters and the turning pages of reports. The Tiger had finally met an enemy it could not defeat: arithmetic. Summer 1944. The coast of Normandy burned beneath an endless sky of smoke and gunfire. The long-awaited Allied invasion of Western Europe was underway, and for the German army, the war that had once advanced on every horizon was now collapsing on all of them at once. In the weeks after D-Day, German heavy tank battalions were ordered to halt the Allied breakout. Among them were the Tigers, the same machines that had terrified American and British soldiers in Tunisia only a year before. They rolled into battle once more, their engines straining, their tracks chewing through the hedgerows and mud. Yet even before they fired a shot, they were already fighting an enemy they could not see: fuel. By June 1944, Allied air power ruled the skies. Railways were torn apart daily. Convoys vanished under clouds of bombs. Bridges fell, fuel trains burned, depots exploded. The lifeblood of the German war machine, oil, was vanishing faster than it could be replaced. Tigers, Panthers, and every other armored vehicle depended on those same supply lines. But none demanded more than the Tiger. Each one consumed enough gasoline in a week to keep an entire infantry regiment moving. Reports from the field became increasingly desperate. In the war diaries of the SS Heavy Panzer Battalion 101, one entry from July 1944 reads simply, "Fuel exhausted after 4 hours of fighting. Pursuit impossible." The battalion had destroyed 16 Sherman and Cromwell tanks that morning, yet by afternoon they sat immobile, watching the enemy retreat safely out of range. Victory, once measured in destroyed tanks, was now measured in gallons burned. As the Allies pushed inland from the beaches, their logistical strength began to tell. American engineers built makeshift roads, pipelines, and depots almost as quickly as infantry advanced. A Sherman division could refuel, rearm, and be back in motion within hours. For the Germans, movement itself became a luxury. Panzer divisions that had once dashed across Europe now advanced only at night to conserve fuel. The Tiger units, prized by Hitler and demanded at every crisis point, often never arrived at all. They were stranded halfway to the front, waiting for convoys that never came. A U.S. reconnaissance squad that reached the outskirts of St. Lo on July 12th found 3 Tigers abandoned beside a hedgerow. Their hatches were open, the interiors spotless, their guns still loaded. There were no burn marks, no battle scars, only the faint smell of spilled gasoline. One of the American officers who examined them later wrote, "We didn't defeat them, the Germans just stopped moving." The Tigers still fought with terrifying effectiveness when fuel and ammunition were available. At Villers-Bocage, one Tiger commanded by the famed Michael Whitman ambushed a British column, destroying more than a dozen vehicles in minutes. The attack was a reminder of what the machine could do in the hands of a skilled crew. But even Whitman's tank, after its rampage, could not exploit the victory. It ran low on fuel and withdrew. The same pattern repeated across the front, short bursts of brilliance followed by long silences. German commanders began referring to their heavy battalions as fire brigades, sent only to crisis points where their presence might buy time, not victory. A Tiger was no longer a weapon of maneuver. It was a stationary fortress, a desperate hope. American and British tankers soon learned that they did not need to destroy the Tiger in direct combat. They only needed to outlast it. Sherman divisions advanced relentlessly, circling through open country, striking where the heavy German armor could not follow. The lighter, faster tanks moved dozens of miles each day, while the Tigers crawled from one defensive position to the next, burning more fuel than they could replace. One U.S. after-action report from August 1944 recorded that more than 30 German tanks, including Tigers and Panthers, were found intact but abandoned during the Allied breakout from St. Lo. Most had full ammunition stores and empty fuel tanks. The report concluded simply, "Enemy armored potential neutralized by logistical exhaustion." Every Tiger left behind was another piece of evidence proving what the Aberdeen engineers had discovered a year earlier. The German heavy tank was not defeated by armor-piercing rounds, but by supply lines measured in miles and gallons. While the tank battles raged on the ground, the real executioner of the Tiger operated high above. The U.S. Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force pounded every road, rail line, and depot feeding the German front. Fighter bombers prowled the countryside, diving on anything that moved. A single fuel truck was as valuable a target as a tank. German tank crews learned to fear not just enemy armor, but the shadow of aircraft wings. They drove only at night, hiding under trees by day, their engines cold, their batteries fading. The constant waiting eroded morale. An entry in the diary of a Tiger mechanic in Normandy read, "We repair by moonlight and pray for clouds." The tank that had once been Germany's pride now symbolized its helplessness, powerful yet paralyzed. By late August, the Allied breakout from Normandy had become a rout. German divisions retreated east in disarray, leaving their heavy weapons behind. Along the roads through Falaise, Lisieux, and Chartres, Allied soldiers passed dozens of Tigers lying silent in the dust. Some had been destroyed by their crews. Others simply stood empty, like monuments to the hubris of a dying empire. American photographers documented them carefully. In each picture, the tanks looked almost serene, their massive barrels pointing skyward, their armor unscarred. They had not been beaten in battle. They had been abandoned by arithmetic. In the archives of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, those photographs were later matched to fuel log data taken from captured German units. The numbers told the same story across every front. Where fuel consumption exceeded 4 gallons per mile, no heavy tank unit lasted more than 3 weeks in continuous operation. When the first of those photographs reached Aberdeen, General Barnes reportedly spread them out across his desk in silence. Each image was a confirmation. Each empty Tiger was a data point. He turned to Colonel Jarrett and said quietly, "They built perfection for a world that doesn't exist anymore." Jarrett nodded. "And now it's ours to learn from." In that moment, the myth of the tiger ceased to be a weapon of fear and became something else entirely: a teacher. The engineers and officers who had tested Tiger 712 now saw its scattered remains across France, each one a reminder that power without sustainability is illusion. The great German machine had not fallen in a glorious duel of armor and fire, but in the mundane failure of logistics, maintenance, and fuel. As September arrived and Allied forces advanced toward the German border, tiger wrecks dotted the French countryside like fossils from another age. Children climbed on their hulls, farmers used their tracks to anchor fences. For the men who had fought against them, the sight was liberating. The nightmare that had stalked their imagination was gone. It had died quietly, not with explosions, but with silence. The silence of an empty fuel tank. In that silence lay the truth that would define the rest of modern warfare. The most powerful weapon is useless without the means to keep it moving. Autumn 1944. The German army was in retreat on every front. From the Baltic to the Vosges, the once unstoppable Wehrmacht had become a collection of fragments, divisions on paper, fighting groups in name only. And among these remnants, the proud Tiger battalions limped backward toward the fatherland, dragging with them the broken promise of German armor. The Allies had learned to read the trail the Tigers left behind. Every few miles, another burned-out husk, sometimes destroyed by enemy fire, but more often by its own crew. When fuel ran out, when tow cables snapped, when recovery vehicles never arrived, German tankers placed demolition charges under their machines and walked away. The explosions echoed like confessions, admissions that even the most powerful tank in the world could not survive a war it could no longer move through. For the men of Heavy Panzer Battalion 503, retreat had become a way of life. They had once thundered across the steppes of Ukraine, across the plains of Poland, through the dust of Hungary, their tigers crushing everything in their path. Now they crawled along narrow roads clogged with refugees, horses, and carts, the mighty engines idling to save the last drops of fuel. Each tiger carried just enough gasoline for 30 miles. It was not enough to reach the next supply dump. Orders came by radio to abandon half the battalion's tanks. The crews removed the breech blocks, destroyed radios, and set charges. The sky flashed orange over the forests of East Prussia as one tiger after another went up in flames. Men who had once been kings of the battlefield now trudged through the mud beside peasants, carrying rifles instead of commanding armor. For those who survived, the humiliation was crushing. They had believed in the machine. Now, the machine was gone, and with it, the illusion of victory. In December 1944, Adolf Hitler launched a desperate counterattack through the Ardennes. The plan was bold: to drive the Allies back to the sea, split their armies, and force a peace settlement. It was Germany's final gamble, and at its spearhead were heavy tanks, Panthers, King Tigers, and the last remaining Tiger I battalions. But even as the offensive began, the fuel shortage had already doomed it. German officers knew it. Allied intelligence knew it. The only man who refused to believe it was Hitler himself. The 6th Panzer Army, which included the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and its Tiger units, started the attack with fuel reserves for only 150 kilometers of movement. They were expected to capture Allied fuel dumps along the way to keep going. It was a plan built on hope, and hope cannot run an engine. At first, the offensive achieved surprise. American lines buckled, towns fell, and fog covered the skies, grounding Allied aircraft. But as the weather cleared, so did the illusion. Allied bombers and fighter bombers swarmed the roads. Fuel convoys were annihilated before they could reach the front. Tigers rolled to a stop one by one, stranded along forest roads of Belgium. The most famous example came with Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead of the German attack. Led by SS officer Joachim Peiper, his column of tanks, including Tigers, fought their way to the town of Stoumont, but their advance had consumed nearly all available fuel. Peiper radioed for resupply again and again. None came. The Tigers sat in the snow, engines silent, barrels rimmed with frost. The crews, unable to move or retreat, set charges and destroyed their own machines. When American forces retook the area days later, they found the wrecks scattered across the fields, perfectly intact, as if frozen in time. One American officer who inspected them later wrote in his report, "The Tigers were beaten not by guns, but by distance." The myth of the invincible German tank died there in the Belgian snow. What had once symbolized Hitler's invincible war machine had become a monument to its exhaustion. By early 1945, Germany's entire war economy was collapsing under the weight of its own consumption. Synthetic fuel plants, once capable of producing 2 million tons of gasoline annually, now produced barely a tenth of that. The railway network was shattered. Bridges lay in ruins. Even the Luftwaffe was grounded, not for lack of aircraft, but for lack of fuel. In January, Tiger battalions on the Eastern Front received orders that could have come from a different age. Limit training to engine starts only. Movement is forbidden except in combat emergencies. The mighty tanks that had once roamed from Leningrad to the Black Sea now sat cold in their garages, drained of life before a battle even began. The engineers who had built them at Henschel, Krupp, and Maybach read the same grim reports. Many of them knew it was coming. They had warned that the Tiger's appetite for fuel made it unsustainable. But wartime politics had silenced them. Hitler wanted armor that inspired fear, not one that could actually be maintained in the long grind of war. By March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, fewer than 80 Tiger-washed tanks remained operational across all fronts. Most were stationed in Germany itself, guarding bridges and crossroads that no longer mattered. The new Tiger II, heavier and even more fuel-hungry, had proven no better. Many never reached the battlefield at all. In the ruins of Cologne, American tank crews faced one of the last Tigers to fight on German soil. A Sherman from the 3rd Armored Division engaged it at close range. The duel was brief. The American tank, faster and more maneuverable, circled its opponent and fired into its side armor. When the Tiger's crew bailed out, the tank stood burning beneath the shattered cathedral towers, a symbol of everything Germany had built and lost. One war correspondent wrote, "It looked like a lion shot through the heart, standing tall even as it died." As Germany crumbled, Tigers were left behind in barns, forests, and river valleys. Many were captured by advancing Soviet and American forces without a single shot fired. Some were later shipped to proving grounds in the United States, Britain, and the USSR for study. Most were simply scrapped where they stood. They were too heavy to move, too complex to repair, too costly to keep. A Soviet engineer examining one near Berlin summed it up in a sentence that mirrored the conclusion at Aberdeen 2 years earlier. They built a god that could not walk. In the spring of 1945, as the war ended, Colonel George Jarrett completed his last report on the captured Tiger 712, still sitting at Aberdeen Proving Ground, perfectly preserved. He wrote, "The Tiger fulfills every tactical demand placed upon it and fails every logistical one. It represents the limits of engineering divorced from sustainability. The lesson is eternal. No machine, however perfect, can outrun its supply lines." That single sentence became required reading for officers in the years after the war. It was printed in training manuals and repeated in lectures at Fort Knox and West Point. The Americans had not only captured a tank, they had captured a philosophy. By May 1945, the last Tigers that could still move were surrounded near Berlin. Crews destroyed them rather than let them fall into enemy hands. When the shooting finally stopped, only a handful of Tigers remained intact anywhere in the world. Tiger 712 in America was one of them. In the ruins of Europe, the myth had finally burned out. The tank that once embodied fear itself was now a relic, its roar replaced by silence. Yet in that silence lay a truth that would echo for generations. Germany's finest engineering had built the perfect weapon for the wrong kind of war. A weapon that could win battles, but never a campaign. A machine that proved strength without endurance is only a slower kind of defeat. The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945. Cities lay in ruins, bridges shattered, railways twisted into blackened steel. Among the wreckage stood the abandoned monuments of Hitler's war, aircraft with empty fuel tanks, submarines rusting in their pens, and heavy tanks half buried in the mud of retreat. Among them, the Tiger reigned supreme in defeat, powerful, magnificent, and utterly motionless. In the United States, thousands of miles away from the ruins of Berlin, Tiger 712 still stood inside its hangar at Aberdeen Proving Ground, the same tank that had been recovered from the olive groves of Tunisia 2 years earlier. Unlike its brothers left to rot in Europe, this one had survived, not as a weapon, but as a teacher. In the first months after the war, American ordnance officers reopened the file on the Tiger evaluation. It was no longer classified as an active intelligence project, but as a historical case study. The engineers who had once tested it during wartime now returned to examine it in peace. Many had fought in Europe themselves, and now they stood before the machine that had once haunted their reports and dreams. The Tiger's armor still bore its original German gray paint. The Maybach engine, long drained of fuel, sat clean and oiled. Its turret was locked in place, the 88mm gun elevated as if in defiance of time itself. Every bolt and hinge, every hydraulic line and gear still reflected the precision of its makers. Officers led tours for new recruits and engineering students. They pointed to the armor thickness, 100mm at the front, 80 at the sides. They explained how it could withstand nearly any Allied gunfire of 1943. And then, with equal weight, they explained how it had failed. One instructor summed it up perfectly to a group of young cadets. It wasn't beaten by our guns, it was beaten by our gas tanks. The Tiger had become a paradox, the most admired and pitied machine of the war. Throughout the late 1940s and 1950s, the Tiger 712 was used as a reference model for engineering courses at the U.S. Army Armor School. Its dismantled engine parts were displayed beside sections of the American Sherman and Pershing tanks. Students compared not only performance but philosophy. The instructors encouraged them to ask questions that went beyond machinery. How much power is too much? When does armor stop being protection and start being burden? What is the cost of complexity in the chaos of war? The answers, written in reports and notebooks, shaped the foundation of modern American tank design. Every future armored vehicle would be built with those questions in mind. The Tiger had taught them that the perfect balance of firepower, protection, and mobility could not exist without logistics. It was not enough to build a tank that could destroy everything in front of it. It had to be a tank that could keep moving, one that mechanics could fix in the field, one that supply lines could feed, one that could fight not for an hour but for weeks. The lessons from Aberdeen directly influenced the development of the M26 Pershing and later the M46 and M48 Patton series. American engineers retained the Tiger's respect for thick frontal armor and long-range gunnery, but they stripped away its excess weight and complexity. The Patton's gasoline engine achieved nearly 5 times the Tiger's fuel efficiency, and every part was designed to be replaced quickly by field crews using standard tools. When the M1 Abrams entered service in 1980, its designers still spoke of the Tiger. It weighed 70 tons, even heavier, but its turbine engine, despite the appetite for jet fuel, could drive it more than 300 miles on a full load. And unlike the Tiger, the Abrams had the global logistics of a modern superpower behind it. What Germany had built as a monument to strength, America had transformed into a lesson in sustainability. In the years following the war, Allied technical teams scoured Europe, recovering surviving German vehicles for study. The British sent their own captured Tiger to the Bovington camp in Dorset, where it still stands today. Tiger 131, restored and operational. The Soviets dissected several others in Kubinka, their engineers admiring the craftsmanship while condemning its inefficiency. France tried to use captured Panthers and Tigers in its post-war army, but quickly discovered the same fate that had doomed the Germans. One French report in 1947 concluded, "They are tanks for victory, not for endurance. They are beautiful machines that cannot serve a tired nation." No sentence could better describe the paradox of the Tiger. In 1989, after more than 4 decades at Aberdeen, Tiger 712 was transferred to the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Collection at Fort Benning, Georgia, now Fort Moore. Its left side was cut open to reveal the inner workings of its transmission and engine. Visitors could peer inside the heart of the machine that had once shaken battlefields across Europe. It became a permanent exhibit, a silent mentor to generations of soldiers and engineers. Time had softened its menace. The once fearsome 88mm gun now pointed harmlessly toward the ceiling lights. Children walked beneath it, gazing up in awe, unaware that the very tank before them had changed the way armies thought about war. One plaque beside the display carries Colonel Jarrett's final words. The Tiger tank achieved everything its designers promised tactically and failed strategically. Firepower and armor can win a battle, but only fuel and logistics can win a war. After the war, the German engineers who had built the Tiger were interrogated by Allied officials. Most admitted they had known of the tank's limitations from the start. Ferdinand Porsche, whose rival design had lost the production contract to Henschel, remarked dryly, "They asked for a fortress, not a tank. We gave them one." Heinrich Kneipkamp, one of the lead designers, confessed that he had warned the German Army High Command that the Tiger's weight and fuel consumption would cripple operations. His report, written in 1942, had been dismissed by Hitler himself. "Victory will come before logistics matter," the Führer had said. But by 1945, even the most devoted Nazi officers could no longer deny reality. The very traits that had made the Tiger an icon, its thickness, its power, its perfection, had also made it a prisoner of its own design. In the decades that followed, the Tiger became more than a tank. It became a symbol. Historians, model builders, and filmmakers turned it into a myth reborn, the embodiment of German engineering, the ghost of a war that had worshipped machines. Its name appeared in documentaries, in museums, in reenactments. For some, it represented the fear it once inspired. For others, it stood as a warning, the arrogance of perfection without practicality. The tank that had once terrorized soldiers now educated them. Every time a cadet touched its armor or traced the welds of its turret, he was reminded of the balance between brilliance and blindness. The Tiger had not simply been defeated by the Allies, it had been defeated by the limits of human ambition. Today, only a handful of Tigers remain intact across the world. Most are silent exhibits in glass halls or open fields. Their engines will never roar again, but their story continues to echo in every armored vehicle that followed. In Fort Moore, the light through the museum windows falls across Tiger 712's open side. Dust motes drift through the air. The smell of old steel lingers faintly in the room. Visitors pause before it, reading the words engraved beside its tracks. Power means nothing without movement. Strength means nothing without endurance. Outside, the roar of modern Abrams tanks echoes across the training fields. They are faster, more reliable, more efficient. The descendants of lessons learned from the Tiger's failure. The old tank rests in silence, no longer feared, but respected. Its final contribution was not destruction, but understanding. The Tiger's story is not only about war or technology. It is about the human pursuit of perfection and the blindness that often comes with it. In its day, it was the most formidable weapon ever built. It embodied everything Germany believed about strength and superiority. And yet, it became the clearest proof that no weapon, however advanced, can escape the laws of supply, endurance, and reality. As the narrator's voice fades, the camera lingers on the weathered steel of Tiger 712. Once the terror of battle, now the teacher of peace. In the end, the narrator says softly, the Tiger did not lose to the Sherman, or to the soldier, or even to time. It lost to the simple truth that power without purpose and strength without support are doomed to rust in silence. The frame holds a moment longer on the tank's silent gun barrel. Then the screen fades to black. Only the faint echo of the narrator's final words remains. Firepower wins battles. Logistics wins wars.